All right. Well, I'll. I'm Micah. I don't know if I met all you guys, but Central Chapter Chair. Um, yeah, I guess maybe because so many people decided not to come tonight because the weekend meeting. Oh, all it is.
Last time we were concerned, we needed to go to a larger room.
I know, right?
Standing room.
Don't make Chad feel bad.
It's got to be that. But thanks for coming out, Dr. King.
Yeah.
Dr. King is one of my graduate advisors, and so I'm excited to see your on my committee. Sorry, I can't think right now. I'm tired. But yes, he's gonna give us a talk about the research he does with trees. So thank you for coming. I gotta leave early tonight, so say bye right now. But I'll be here for most of the meeting. So we got some more people coming in. Oh,
You ever talk about your research?
I am gonna this spring. Yeah, I'm planning on it. Yeah. Yeah.
How are you?
Hey.
All right, good evening. Hi, I'm Chad, and I'm going to spend about 45 minutes talking about what I do as a researcher as it relates to native trees in Oklahoma. I've been at UCO now for 10 years. I'm in my 11th year, and the first thing I wanted to show the Native Plant Society was this picture. Not this picture, this picture. So almost to the date, right today, 10 years ago, I presented at the Native Plant Society with my very first presentation. I had just moved to Oklahoma, and it was out at Arcadia Lake. And that was a picture I took of the Native Plant Society group 10 years ago. I found that in my Google Photos. So I'm very familiar with this organization, and it's nice to be back 10 years later. I had just started, I don't think I had even collected a single piece of wood from Oklahoma at that point. And so tonight I'm going to talk about what we've done over the last decade in learning more about the trees that we have in Oklahoma, talking about some of the older trees that we have found, where we found them, what might have led them to become old. And also we'll talk about some characteristics that you can look for that might define an old tree. Okay. So tonight we're going to kind of go through some of the aspects of what we do. So the central focus of what I do is all about the rings that are inside the trees. Obviously, you know, we can count these, right? We can count these rings and we can get an idea of how old the tree is at that height where we cut it. That's assuming that a tree is putting on a ring each year. Okay, then we can count those. So that's one of the troublesome aspects of using and studying rings, is that there's times when a tree might not put on a ring in a given year, or it may put on a ring on one side of the tree but not on the other side. And so I'm going to talk about that process that we use to figure out, are we actually getting all the rings in the tree? Or are we missing some? Or tonight we're not going to talk about it, but trees can also put on what we call false rings. And what looks like it is a true ring actually isn't. And so we have to be able to work through all of that to actually figure out, in this case, how old the tree is. So the science that I do is something called dendrochronology. So what is dendrochronology? Dendrochronology is a science in which we are trying to date each tree ring to their exact year of formation. And then if we can do that, I like to tell audiences the world is my oyster. I can do so many things, figure out so many things about trees and tree rings, if I can put calendar years on each of the rings that are being formed. And so I list some of these down at the bottom. They can be used to study everything from studying historic climate, going back into the 1700s, 1600s, even further back than that. A lot of what I do is study fire and historic fires, and I have a sample I brought tonight that I'll show you that shows evidence of a fire that scarred the tree. At one time, a wildfire didn't kill the tree, and we'll talk about what the tree did in response to that. And then pick up anything that's built out of wood. So old buildings, for instance, if there are enough tree rings in the wood that was used to build the building, we can put calendar years on that, and sometimes figure out when the building was built. It's used quite a bit in Europe. There's a lot of studies of castles and when different sections of castles were built, all with the framing wood that was used when they were building the castle. That's not this. I wish it was. So this was a floorboard in a barn. The owner of the barn wanted to know, you tell me when the barn was built. I said, well, if you send me a couple of pieces of wood from the barn, I might be able to get an estimate of when that barn was built. So the rings in this go all the way back to 1639. So this is shortleaf pine, which is native here in Oklahoma. This tree going back to 1639. The outside ring on this is 1889. And so typically in the late 1800s, early 1900s, settlers in areas would utilize the wood that was on their property. They would cut it, they would mill it, often on site, and then use that wood to actually build houses, barns, whatever. So our best estimate was that barn was built sometime after 1889. So probably right after maybe 1890 or 1891. They wouldn't leave wood kind of sitting around. They would actually use it pretty quickly in building that, in this case, that barn. So tonight you're going to kind of get a story of some different sites that we have been to over the last decade and some of the trees that we have found that are predating 1800 in many cases. They're still living trees today. So we're talking 250 to 300-year-old trees that still exist in Oklahoma. The process of this is twofold. If it is a living tree like that birch that is there, we don't cut the tree down. We don't need to cut the tree down to see the tree rings. What Joe and Justin are doing are in the process of what we do called pouring the tree. So we use this instrument that I brought tonight. It's called an increment borer. And so it has a drill bit on one end, has these handles, and we can stand or often kneel next to the tree and then drill this, turn this into the tree. And this is hollow on the inside. And so as we're drilling in, the hollow part of this fills up with a piece of wood. Then we can extract it with this instrument and we end up with so I'll pass it around a little bit closer. That little sliver of wood is what we're taking out of the tree. Okay. So does it injure the tree? Yes, it injures the tree. It does leave a hole in the tree for a period of time until the tree can cover up the outside of that hole. But generally what we've always found is the trees are just fine, okay, after we do this. So we will, I don't cut living trees with chainsaws because we have other ways of extracting the tree rings out of it. If it's a snag or a dead standing tree, we'll take a chainsaw to it and then basically take a cross section of it out so we can look at all the rings. That's one of the downsides of doing that is we're only getting a picture of a little sliver of the tree rings that are actually inside the tree. It's much better to see the whole piece to be able to really accurately gauge the tree itself. So we collect the samples. This was some work we did in Houtonia Bottoms back in 2016 when that was just became a new preserve for the Nature Conservancy. Usually we bring these samples back to the lab and we do what we call processing the samples, and that's essentially just sanding them. So when we cut the sample, it kind of looks like this, okay, very rough. But then we use progressively finer sandpaper, starting with 80 grit, we go up to 1200 grit, and sand this nice and smooth so that when we put this underneath the microscope, you can see individual cells of the rings that are in there, and that helps us also identify ring boundaries inside the tree. So sanding, this is obviously not Oklahoma. This is Wyoming when we were out there in 2014 doing some work. And then this is my favorite part. Students say this is very, very tedious. We take each of the samples that we have and we look at them underneath the microscope. And then this instrument here is a sliding stage. So we can manually rotate it on one side, rotate it there, and it'll move this stage. And what we're actually doing is measuring the width of each ring that is in the tree. We're getting ring width measurements. We take those ring width measurements and we compare them between trees from the same forest. And the reason that we do that is because for trees that are often in the same forest, they're responding similarly to climate each year. So if it was a really wet year for a tree, then it's probably going to produce a wide ring. If it's a very dry year or drought year, it's not going to produce a very big ring, a very narrow ring. All those trees are going to show a similar pattern. And then we can more confidently say, there is the 1953 ring, for instance. We also have to be really good at memorizing dates because the patterns are really similar across Oklahoma and across the south central part of the United States. So I have dates memorized for Oklahoma. 2006 is a narrow ring. 1996 is a narrow ring. 1981 is a narrow ring. 1953 is a narrow ring. 1911 is a narrow ring. During the Dust Bowl, 1934 was a narrow ring. 1935 is a wide ring. 1936 is a narrow ring. It almost shows up universally across trees here in Oklahoma. So that is what we're doing here. Underneath the microscope, this is what we're seeing. This is a oak. We can look at rings in many cases, and based on the pattern of the cells that are in the ring, we can at least tell what genus the tree is without any other information. So I've highlighted on here blue and yellow. What we're looking at is, the blue is what we call the early wood of the ring. The early wood is what the tree is putting on in the spring. That transitions to the yellow that you're seeing. The yellow inside the ring is late wood. So the tree is putting on late wood. It's also called summer wood. So they're putting this part of the ring on during the summer. So a combination of this early wood and this late wood give us one growth ring that would go all the way around the tree potentially. So that's one ring there. Notice this one, much, much smaller, has a pretty nice large early wood, but hardly any kind of late wood in it. So that narrow ring might be a really important marker here for that particular tree and for the trees that are in that forest. So we look at those patterns. We're really getting an estimate of the width of each of the rings when we're measuring them. So that process, it kind of in a nutshell, is what we call cross dating. Dendrochronology, the basic tenet of dendrochronology is cross dating. And what that allows us to do is if we were to core several trees in a forest with the increment borer, take cores from all the different trees that are here, and if all the rings are matching up in terms of width, narrow rings in certain years, wide rings in other years, we can go back in time and kind of get an idea of what might have been going on around that tree based on how wide or how narrow that ring is. We might get samples of wood, say from a log cabin that is in the area of that same forest. And if that wood that was used to build the house here came from that same forest, that wood is probably older than the living trees that are in the forest. And so what we might expect to see is an overlap in terms of widths, ring widths in the trees. So that allows us to go back even further in time. Then we might get another sample that is older than this, but these sections of these two pieces match up in terms of ring width, and we can keep going back in time with pieces of wood that we happen to find in the forest. So this one from Lake Thunderbird, this was a dead stump, dead snag in the forest, and I cut it with a chainsaw, sanded the other side. So I don't know when this tree died in the forest or how long it's been in the forest. What that means then is I don't know what this ring is on the outside. Trees are putting new rings on just underneath the bark every year. So I'm not sure what year this is out here. nor do I know what year this is, the center of the tree. So this is where I had to core trees around Lake Thunderbird, especially oak, because generally oaks are really long lived. Cross-stated all of the living trees and then looked for patterns in the living wood that might overlap with this. And so if I was able to overlap a section of this that is out here, then I can say, oh, there's that 1995. And therefore I can keep going backwards in time, back to 1793, when this tree started growing. So any wood that has lots of rings on it, we can often figure out how old that wood is, okay, from the forest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different increment cores, like was being passed around. We can sometimes see this in the ring. So these are 5 different trees from the same forest. Those 3 dots right there, that's the 1700 ring. So if we pay attention to 1690 rings, like 1687 to about 1691, what we see is in each of these trees, the rings tend to get a little bit more narrow than those that are around it on either side. So we can more accurately assign calendar years to each of these based on the pattern of the rings that are in there. And so even though this one was growing really fast for a while, it was growing really slow during that same time period of 1690. So tonight, I'm not going to talk about all these sites, but these are sites that we have sampled trees. We're going to highlight some of them because some of them are going to indicate some relatively old trees that we have found over the last decade in Oklahoma. Some of them are private property. A lot of them actually were going to OAS field meetings and coring trees at OAS field meetings in some cases. So I'll talk about a few of these tonight. We're going to kind of move around the state. So we have Oklahoma City, the metropolitan area here in the center. Around Arcadia Lake, this was actually one of the first sites that I cored when I moved here to Oklahoma. So on the south side of the lake, there is a group of post oak that date back into the early 1800s. The oldest one dated back to 1821. Again, these are all living trees. As we go further east, south of Chandler, this is private property. We have some trees that are dating back into the 1700s, late 1700s. Our recent work down here around Lake Thunderbird found some living old trees that are dating back to the 17 and early 1800s. This is Hafer Park in Edmond. So the oldest tree that we found there dates only back to 1908. So as we're kind of moving a little bit more westward, where there's fewer trees, a lot more development, we don't necessarily find as many older trees in the vicinity of the city. Moving west, so to give you some sense of where we're at here, here's Clinton. So we've cored a few trees out here. Yes, there are trees. And this is private property. This was farmland that I was invited out to core some trees out there. That's the bur oak and the chitomwood that we found. Surprisingly, there's not a lot of work that's been done on chitomwood. So we really don't know how old chitomwood could potentially be. So with some of the chitomwood that I've seen around Edmond, these that were out west, I'm thinking they could easily be over 100 years old in some places. If you've never seen chitomwood, I should have brought some chitomwood wood. It is beautiful wood. It really is. Texas live oak, that's actually this tree I was coring right here. You don't get a good, pictures are awful. It's so much better to take you so you can see the tree. This tree is growing out of the rock here, and it is shorter than I am. So I'm kneeling down. The top of the tree, it's kind of hard to see, but the top of the tree is right there. So this tree was hollow. So when it's hollow, I can't get the wood that normally would be in the center of the tree. All of this had rotted away inside the tree, so I can't figure out exactly how old that tree is. But this is That's the tree that went back to at least 1901. I know it goes back even further than that. It was just a short little tree. Trying to grow for 100 years in the crack of the rock on a hill slope. So jumping out to Black Mesa. I don't want to go back to Black Mesa. We have another meeting out at Black Mesa. Okay. Because these two, talk about this and I'll show you these two. So a couple of trees, one seed juniper out there in Western Hackberry. One of the one seed junipers that we collected living dated back to the mid 1800s out there. When you go out there, there's a lot of bluffs and cliffs. And so in those areas, trees can grow in the cliffs. That's a really great protected area. So from fire in particular. So where we were looking was along those cliff faces, along those bluffs, where the trees have been protected for a while. And that's where we started finding some of our older trees. So I don't know if you know Zach Jones, he's at SWASU. This was an OAS field meeting a few years ago when we were out there. This is Western Hackberry, and I took this picture because Zach is just a little bit taller than I am. Give you a sense of how tall this tree is. The diameter of the tree was, I don't know, maybe about that big around. This was, or is, I should say, because I hope it's still living. This Western Hackberry that dated 1800. We also collected some other smaller trees that were out there. This is pretty common too. So this is also one seed juniper. I'll pass around. You'll see if you can actually see the rings in this. So this one seed juniper had 71 rings. 71-year-old tree with diameter only of that. This is a Western Hackberry. That was the size of the tree when we cut it. It dates back to 1955 or started growing in 1955 to 2019 when we were out there. So that leads me to this. So you don't get anything else out of tonight. So I have two different pieces of wood here from two different trees. They're almost the same diameter. Okay. This is a maple from one of my students' yards. So in their yard, they watered it all the time. So the tree, when they cut it down, was 21 years old. This is spruce. This spruce has 140 rings. So generally, we can't look at a tree and say, well, it's big, it's got to be old. Okay, for instance, generally you can have relatively small diameter trees that are pretty old for the species itself. So again, two different species, two different locations, generally the same size. So that as we'll talk, that's going to indicate maybe something about the spruce and where it was growing versus where the maple was growing in the yard. Moving a little bit to the southeast now, Robbers Cave State Park. Again, another OAS field meeting that we were at. That's this pine, shortleaf pine, 1845. Hopefully it's still living. It's actually this tree that's growing right next to this building. So this tree, it's a nice big shortleaf pine there. Walking around, when I saw that, I said, oh, that's got to be the whole tree. And here's why for gymnosperm like pine. When you look at the trees that are around it, smaller diameter, but they have a nice, almost conical shaped crown to them, right? So kind of nice crown up here to the tree. That tells me that's a young tree. This tree has been through some things. It's lost part of the top of its crown. It's got a lot of branches down the side of the stem that are dead. So it doesn't have very much of a crown to it. It's got a little bit of crown that is up here. So it can't photosynthesize very well because it doesn't have enough needles. When it can't photosynthesize very well, it ends up not producing very much wood each year. So the rings are really, really narrow in this case. So this is the 1845 shortleaf pine that we found. Surprisingly, I'm surprised when they built this building that they didn't move or cut down the tree. They left the tree there, and it's an amazing tree. I hope it's still there. This is Hatonia Bottoms, Nature Conservancy property in Choctaw County, I believe. We were specifically sampling hilltops in the areas, looking for really old trees, post oak, black hickory that are down there. So again, dating back into the 1800s, some of these living trees. And then this is one of my newer sites that we're working at. I'm very excited. We've only cored a handful of trees. Potentially got a new graduate student that's going to start in the spring, and this is going to be her project. This is Turkey Mountain Wilderness Area in Tulsa. We have been sampling a few trees just to get an idea of age. The first time I was out there with my colleague, and we were walking around, I was looking up and the post oaks that are out there. I'm like, oh wow, I bet these are some old trees that are up here. And so far, the oldest one, living tree that we found, dates back to 1774. If we have time, we're going to talk about what I saw that indicated why I thought they might be old trees. And these are things that you can look for as well. And so we're going to start working that site a little bit more. Very, very rocky hilltop area, dry soil conditions, sandy soil. So water doesn't stay in the soil for very long. So these trees generally are growing really, really slowly. Yeah, so let's talk about, so this paper that's on the left, defined by Neil Peterson. Neil Peterson has done a tremendous amount of work in the eastern deciduous forest. He has collected wood from thousands of different trees. And with that expertise, he started to compile a list of characteristics of trees that he was seeing that might indicate they were older than average trees. Okay, so not necessarily old growth forest, but old trees that are still in the forest. So I'm going to show you some pictures of some of these tonight of trees that we have found. And I'll just kind of briefly talk about what these each mean. So smooth or balding bark. Generally, as a tree gets older, it puts on, continuously putting on new bark, the outside of the tree. But the bark on the outside of the tree can break off, decomposes, that bark has to be replaced over time. But as trees get older, they slow down their growth, and therefore they don't put on as much bark each year that they did when they were young. And so generally what we see on older trees is the bark is very, very smooth on the outside of the tree. There's not a lot of ridges on the bark of the tree. Low stem tapering, I've got some pictures to show you that. We're talking about the base of the tree. Sometimes there's a flare at the base of the tree. And then as you look up the tree, the trunk of the tree kind of gets smaller and smaller. Kind of go up to the top of the tree. That flare that's coming out at the bottom of the tree often indicates a fast growing tree that is likely pretty young. A much older tree is going to have a pretty straight trunk from the ground all the way up to the top. That's usually a tree that has slowed down its growth. High stem sinuosity. So standing underneath the tree, you're looking at the tree, it's not growing nice and straight. It is snaking back and forth, okay, as you're going up the tree. That's usually indicative of a tree that has been injured several times during its life. So it grows, a tree falls over, hits it, it leans this way, and then it tries to straighten itself out. Then another tree falls, it hits it, and bends it this way. So that snaking back and forth, tree is having to recover in terms of its growth, and that tends to slow down that growth process in the tree. Crowns. So generally crowns that don't have very many branches up in the top of the tree. When they don't have very many branches, they can't have very many leaves. And so therefore they can't photosynthesize and produce wood, and they slow down their growth. That's kind of 4, 5, and 6, kind of looking at leaf area. How much leaf area does a crown have? It has just a little bit. It's probably an older tree. Habitat characteristics. I mentioned cliffs when I talked about Black Mesa and bluffs. Those areas where when we go to a new site and we talk to, say, the U.S. Forest Service guys, we say, what is your most rugged, inaccessible place that you have? Can you show us on? We want to find old tree. And so they say, oh yeah, go here, really rocky. And you'll have to climb up a cliff, get to the top, all of these things. Trees that are often growing in those type of environments don't have very much access to water or mineral nutrients from the soil. And in some cases, there's almost no soil for the tree to utilize. Those really dry, harsh condition areas in the upland areas of a habitat often will have some of your older trees as well. So let's take a look at. So habitat characteristics, rocky soils with rocky environments with thin soils. So Black Mesa over here on the left, these kind of hillsides, cliff sides, and bluffs. These are Western hackberries that are in a stressful environment. Not only is it dry out there, when it does rain, there's not much soil to hold the moisture. And so the trees generally tend to grow pretty slowly. Like the one I showed you earlier that dates back into the 1800s. Again, this tree is shorter than I am. And so probably one of those, we didn't date that one, but probably one of those older ones. This one we saw earlier, this little tree that is trying to grow out between two cracks of the rock on the hillside. This going up here to the top of this, you would probably find older trees up here. All of this rock kind of protects the top of the hill from fire. So if there was a wildfire, there isn't fuel up here to carry that fire to the top of the hill. So these trees down here might be young. These up here are probably much, much older because of that habitat characteristic. Other pictures, this one is actually right near the group campsite at Black Mesa. So if we do OAS out there again, this was one that was growing. There's a road down at the bottom of this cliff. It's growing just at the very top of the cliff here. And so we can see how the branches kind of bend back and forth, kind of that sinuosity associated with some external characteristics. It's a little bit taller than I am. That's this same tree here. This one was hollow as well, so we didn't get an accurate date of when that tree likely started growing, but at least in the early 1900s. Walking up to Black Mesa, if you've ever done that trek all the way to the top, part way up, we stopped, and this big juniper here, I couldn't access the tree in here, so I actually cored one of the stems that was coming out. And that individual stem was 198 years old. There was 198 rings just in the stem, which means this tree itself is much, much older than 198 years old. The youngest part of the tree is way up here. The oldest part of the tree is way down here near the ground. Alabaster Caverns has some great cliffs to find hackberry growing on those cliffs. Justin being very, very careful in that case. These are post oaks at Turkey Mountain. That's my colleague Brian, who's helping with some of the coring. A lot of these trees, it's really hard to see this in a picture, but the bark on these trees is very, very smooth. And so bark often on a young tree, because the young tree is growing so fast, produces a lot of bark. And so in cross section, if you're a cross section of bark, and I kind of regret not bringing some tonight, cross section of bark, you might see ridges in the bark. In some cases, really deep ridges. As a tree ages, it stops producing these ridges. It begins to do this. And so all the bark on the tree is very, very thin. We call that balding bark on a tree. Fast growing, slow growing in terms of bark production. Yeah, that's another smooth bark. Those ridges that are on here are not very deep. So the tree has lost a lot of the outside bark on that tree and is not producing the same amount to replace what was being lost. So that was a post oak at Tinker, just off base at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City. Some pictures of older trees from Tonia Bottoms. These are also post oak. This particular tree doesn't look like much. The diameter of it's not that big. It's not even as big as this pine. Much smaller, probably about that size. But it had external characteristics that gave us an indication of the potential of being old. It had smooth bark on the outside, but then it's lost a lot of its crown over its life. So it's got this broken branch here that probably had some leaves and a much longer stem on it. It has one large leading stem up to the crown. So at the top of the crown, you're just going to have this little mass of leaves up there at the top. They're doing all the photosynthesis for this tree. So a few large limbs like this, it's kind of leaning to one side a little bit, like it had been hit by something. When we talk about sinusoidal bending, instead of being nice and straight like it is down here, we get the main stem of this tree kind of going back and forth, like it'd been hit on one side and then hit on the other side. It doesn't have much of a crown either, which might be indicative of being an older tree. So I mentioned stem tapering. The cypress here at Beavers Bend State Park, at the base of the tree, it's much wider than it is as you look up the tree. And usually this tapering that is happening is indicative of faster growth. The tree is growing really fast to kind of anchor itself as it's growing. Over time, though, this begins to slow down and the rest of the tree begins to catch up with it. And that results in low stem tapering. So at the base of this tree, is as wide as up the stem of the tree here. And so this, along with one big stem that goes up into the crown of the tree, that's all it had. This one was hollow as well. It looks like something, a tree fell and slid along the side of it and ripped the bark off the tree there. So this tree was hollow. I had 200 rings just in this tree, but it was probably another 100 easily in that tree at Beavers Bend. This is also oak. Lake Thunderbird, low stem tapering. So we have the same diameter down here at the base of the tree as we see going up the tree. We have a few large branches. It kind of looks like branches broke off of this large branch. These might be branches that grew in recovery once that big branch kind of broke. So that's potentially an older tree, smoothing bark too. That's a bad picture. This is, if you're familiar with Chandler Park in Tulsa, it's a relatively small park that we were invited to do kind of a biosurvey for them, for their naturalist. And so we were walking around, noticed the habitat, very rocky. So thin soils at this location. I was really enamored with this tree. I didn't core it, at least not yet, I haven't. And the reason I'm excited about this is it's not nice and straight like this one, it's leaning to one side. And then when we look up in the crown, it almost looks like several branches had broken out of the crown of the tree at some point during its life. And it has several of these younger branches that are coming out of that bend there and that bend there. So that might be an old post oak that is going to be found at Chandler Park. And then I throw all of that out the window with this group of trees. So this was one of my first studies that I did when I moved to Oklahoma. On the south side of Arcadia Lake, there is a grove of post oaks that are just down the road from the ODWC education building on the lake. These are, when I looked at these trees, this one, I said, oh, they're nice and big. I'll just core them to see how old they are. And they happen to be some of the oldest trees that we know about around Arcadia Lake. They have nice, look at the size of the crown on this tree. It's huge. So it should be, based on everything I said tonight, it should be fast growing. Okay, with all that leaf material that is up there to capture sunlight and make sugars for the tree. Same thing with this tree. This tree has a nice big crown on it, but they were dating back into the 1800s. I mean, so sometimes even all the things that all the external characteristics that we can look at, sometimes we can still find relatively old trees that don't look like they're old, but look like they should be fast growing trees in this case. I think that might have something to do with the soils there. I never really looked into it, but that's okay. So we've worked with a lot of different agencies over the last 10 years. Really the first group that was really interested in knowing ages of trees was the city of Edmond. They have such an extensive park system. They were really interested in that, but I've worked with up in Tulsa. I'm working with River Parks Authority right now. State Park System, Nature Conservancy. We did some work for them as well. So I have to give props to all the different agencies that have allowed me to go onto their properties to actually collect wood and core trees. So with that, I will stop and we can talk, ask questions, curiosities. I like doing this with the shortleaf pine. So this tree started growing in 1859. And so I marked on here the years of the Civil War. We had generally what we see in the south central part of the United States it was a drought during the Civil War. We call it the Civil War drought because at that time between 1861 and 1864 actually was really, really dry. And so the rings are really, really narrow. So UCO was founded, Oklahoma statehood, the tree was this size during the Dust Bowl. These are relatively narrow rings. Actually, there was a drought in the early 1950s in Oklahoma that was a lot more damaging to trees than the Dust Bowl drought was in the 1930s. So we often see really narrow rings early in the 1950s. There's a great paper that was published in the 1950s that talked about all the blackjack oaks that were dying because of the drought. This one lived until 2012. Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks. So I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
So it's like that example that you showed.
Yeah.
A lot of times when you cut wood, firewood, it seems to be lopsided. Are they lopsided? Is there like cardinal direction kind of thing going on? Right.
You're talking about like the center of the tree, right? It's not right in the middle.
Right. In other words,
off
it seems to me they're putting on more wood
They're
on one
putting more
side.
wood on one side. That's a great observation. This often is indicative of a tree that is either during some point in its life of leaning. And in order to straighten itself out, trees want to grow as vertical as possible because they want to outcompete their neighbors for all that light that's up there. So if they're leaning to one side, what they will do each year is put more wood on one side of the tree than the other. And each year what that does is it starts to do this as it's growing, so it starts to straighten itself out. They'll do this also, like those ones that were in the cliff where they were kind of angled. They'll do that same thing. The center of that tree won't be in the center, it'll be offset way over here. And so that's often a response to trying to grow straight up and down.
Structural.
Yeah.